So, last week we started we did our lecture on verbal communication, right? And we went through and we talked a lot about how verbal communication was relational, how it was cultural, how it involved framing, how it was presentational and representational, so on and so forth. So this week we're going to turn our attention to talking about nonverbal communication, which is always a fun topic. Let me ask you, how many of you would consider yourselves to be people watchers? Just love watching people, right? Well, why? Let me ask you why. Why is it fascinating to watch people? Why would you consider yourselves to be people watchers? Yeah.
Everyone's different. It's kind of entertaining.
Okay. It's actually cheap entertainment, first of all, right? It's free entertainment. Everybody's different, right? You get a chance to see nuances and idiosyncrasies in terms of behavior. Why else? Other thoughts?
I was just going to say, people do some weird stuff.
People do some weird stuff sometimes, yeah? You have any favorite places where you like to watch people? Favorite places?
The mall.
At the mall? Yeah, the mall is a good one.
Outside the window of McCormick.
Okay, outside the window. That's just being weird. I'm just kidding. Outside the window of McCormick? Yeah, where else?
Down the shore.
What's that?
Down the shore.
On the shore? Like outside on the beach on the shore? Yeah, at the shore, absolutely. Yeah, where else? At Walmart. Oh boy. Okay, as a matter of fact, you're not the only one that likes to people watch at Walmart. There's a whole site, right? You've seen it, thepeopleofwalmart.com. If you haven't seen it, check it out. Just not right now. Wait until after class. What else? At the airport. I like watching people at the airport too. People really do some weird stuff at the airport, especially. Yeah. What's that? At the DMV. Wow. Yeah, absolutely. So the bottom line, yes. At school events in general. Absolutely. Yeah. Bottom line is that people are fascinating, right? The people are different. They have their own quirks and idiosyncrasies and intricacies, and we can observe a lot about that by watching people's nonverbal communication. And so one of the guiding frames that we're going to talk about this week is that the nonverbal communication is really the true stuff of communication. If you look at our quote here, words are only painted fire, a look is the fire itself, right? So really the essence of communication, and importantly the meaning of communication, a lot of it boils down to the nonverbals. And so that's going to be an important guiding framework for us for this week. And this is where we're headed for the week. We're going to talk a little bit about the characteristics of nonverbal communication, look at why it's important and how nonverbals function in our communication, both our nonverbals and how we might read and decipher other people's nonverbals. And then we're going to talk a lot about different codes and types, and that's actually going to make up the bulk of our discussion for the week. We'll focus a little bit on the interaction of verbal and nonverbal communication, and then we'll talk a little bit about some strategies and tips on Wednesday for effectively communicating nonverbally, as well as how to interpret and decode nonverbal communication, because that intersection between encoding and decoding is really important, and we'll define that here in just a second. So let's start off by thinking about why nonverbal communication is important, and I want us to think about different examples in different contexts. So for instance, there's always a lot of discussion about nonverbals in the context of politics, right? Especially before and after, especially after debates, right? Anybody watch the debates last week? Like 8 people. Okay, that's pretty good, right? The Republican debate was last Wednesday, right? And there was a lot of conversation about different candidates, right? So have you guys heard anything about Donald Trump? What do they say about his nonverbals? Go ahead, please, just talk. It's okay.
Trump likes to make a lot of facial expressions
Yeah.
to show that he's done with the other candidates.
Okay, yeah.
Like, go like, and stuff, so.
Yeah, so he makes a lot of facial impressions, and this is important, what you said, to show that he's done with the other candidates. So in a second, we're going to talk about how you can use your nonverbals to regulate a conversation, to start one, but also just to stop it, right, turn off, right? So he's really good at that, whether he means to or not. That ends up happening with his nonverbals. What else? What else have we heard about Mr. Trump as far as his body language goes? What about gestures? Have you guys heard anything about what he does with his hands? Anybody heard about that? Yeah, please.
He uses also like arm spreading to like guys like a power posture.
Yeah, so you see, he does a lot of spreading out, right? So we can kind of talk about that. We'll talk about it as kinesics and body movement, right? The fact that he kind of spreads out a lot whenever he talks. It's kind of a dominance or a power pose, right? So there's a lot of conversation about that. He also does the pursing of his lips. You know, almost in the same way that a parent would do to a disobedient child, right? So there's a lot of conversation about Donald Trump and his use of body language. How about this? We also hear a lot about body language in the workplace, right? If you were to do a search for nonverbal communication on YouTube, you'd find about 30,000 videos, right? Do the same search, nonverbal communication at work on YouTube, and there's about 9,000 different hits, right, on YouTube. So you can find a lot of tips and strategies about communicating nonverbally at work, and so we'll kind of explore that as we go on. What about sports, right? We hear a lot about sports. We hear a lot about athletes and their use of nonverbals, right? So Tom Brady has been talked about quite a bit for his nonverbals. Last year at the beginning of the season, they had a lot of new receivers, and so they were talking about and they were analyzing his nonverbal behaviors toward the receivers when they didn't perform well in an early game against the Jets, right? And there was a whole special about it, right? And they were saying that, that you can read a lot about his nonverbals and the fact that he was very outspoken, he was boisterous, and to some that was an example of a leader, right, who was trying to hold his, in this case, his teammates accountable, right? On the other end of it, whenever Deflategate happened last year, there was a big analysis of his nonverbals at his initial press conference when they asked him if he knew about releasing air out of the footballs, right? And so there's a big analysis of that, and they talked a lot about. I'm just going to read some of what they analyzed. The fact that he had an insincere smile. The fact that he was swaying back and forth when he was answering questions about it. The fact that he had insincere laughter, right? The fact that he had extended blinking, right? So even very, very, very small subconscious things that we don't realize can be analyzed, and there's a lot of deceit that you can detect just from watching very small slices of somebody's communication. Sorry to keep piling on Jay Cutler, but Jay Cutler's been talked about a lot, right? For because he's sort of the opposite of Tom Brady, right? If Tom Brady is looked at a lot because of being out there and really boisterous, Jay Cutler's on the other end, right? Because he kind of acts like he's aloof and doesn't really care quite as much on the sidelines, right? So again, we hold athletes to a standard as well and kind of watch them. It's not just about politicians, right? Even music, right? Even folks in like Jesse McCartney, right? He talks about body language, right? You guys know this track, right? It's from a few years ago. He knows, right? He doesn't know Spanish, Japanese, or French, right? But the way her body talking definitely makes sense, right? He knows that. He's got it, right? He understands body language. He totally gets it, right? So we kind of intuitively understand. Intuitively understand body language. Let me. Not now, but later on, check out, there's a really good TED Talk on nonverbal communication. The woman's name is Amy Cuddy, and she talks a lot about nonverbal communication. Check it out. Let me just highlight a couple of things that she points out. She talks about the implications of nonverbal communication in a health setting. And she talks about how there's researchers that have found that people can watch real physicians interacting with patients. They can watch soundless clips, right? Soundless clips of patients interacting with physicians for 30 seconds, and they can predict whether or not a physician is likely to be sued, just based on watching 30 seconds of soundless interaction, right? So, and that's based on perceptions of niceness, right? How the doctor treats the patient without any sound whatsoever. Another one related to politics. People can look at candidates' faces for 1 second, and that predicts 70% of Senate and gubernatorial outcomes in the United States. By watching candidates' faces for 1 second, they can predict who's likely to win. Okay? Last one, even in online settings, right? The use of emoticons, the use of appropriate emoticons in online negotiations, right, back and forth on emails, is highly predictive of whether or not an agreement is likely to be able to be reached, right? So again, online settings, offline settings, in the work, in politics, in healthcare, nonverbal communication, and the ability to interpret as well as encode or use nonverbals is incredibly important. So let's take a look here at another example. And we'll think about this in terms of the workplace, but also in general in life. I really like this quote here. It says, "A manager can read you the moment you walk in the door," she says. This is a GM from an executive search firm. "From the clothes you wear to the way you stand to the grip of your first handshake, presenting yourself as a confident, energetic professional is about as basic as career advice gets." Right? So the idea is certainly you can learn a lot about how to behave and perform in the workplace, but even just from the moment you meet someone in the interview, right, they can tell a lot about you just in that first really thin sliced judgment. Another reason we want to think about nonverbal communication is that the majority of the meaning of what we say comes from our nonverbals, right? Estimates are about 93% of the meaning can be interpreted or derived or inferred from the nonverbals in terms of the overall makeup of how we look, as well as the vocal inflection, vocal tones. So you can tell a lot about, so actually the verbal content is actually a pretty small piece. The overall context, the nonverbals, makes up a lot. I want us to think about how nonverbal communication is important because it typically is more believable, right? If the verbal and the nonverbal messages conflict, we're typically going to understand and believe the nonverbal over the verbal, right? Nonverbal communication also does a lot to convey relational meaning, right? So it's not just about what you say, but how you say it. Right, and we'll explore some of those as we move on. And then, of course, again, about 93% of the meaning of nonverbal, the meaning of what people say to us and what we understand comes from not just what we say, but other things that surround it, much of what we'll talk about here. So I want to go through each of these. This makes up the first few pages of the chapter on nonverbal communication. I want to go through each one of these and explore a few examples. So we can talk about how nonverbal communication is symbolic in the same way that verbal communication is symbolic. You guys remind me, because I forget, when we say that something is symbolic, what does that mean? To say that something is symbolic? Yes? Yeah, it represents something else, right? So just like a word can stand for something else, it substitutes, nonverbal communication can as well, right? And just like verbal communication, nonverbal communication involves decoding, which is making sense of a message, as well as encoding, right? Which is the idea that we can purposefully or unintentionally convey information. So decoding is reading and interpreting, and encoding is where you use and convey messages, right? So receiving and sending, decoding, encoding. So the idea is that nonverbals stand for something or substitute for something else. And in the same way, we can look at the fact that nonverbals are polysemic, right? How one gesture or stance or whatever can mean one thing depending on who's decoding or interpreting that message, right? So it's polysemic, and we'll look at that in a second when we talk about ambiguity. We also want to make note of the fact that nonverbals are both dynamic as well as static, right? So there are aspects of nonverbal communication that change, right? That are dynamic. That can be changed, and there are other pieces that are static, that are relatively immovable, if you will, right? So the way that a room is set up in this case would be static, right? We can't do anything in here in terms of the overall arrangement, but what is dynamic are things like facial expressions, right? The way that you have a handshake. If you have a classroom where the chairs move, you can sort of move those around and change the overall makeup and the dynamic of that room, and we'll look at some of those as we go. So there's elements that can change and elements that cannot. The third thing is the idea that nonverbals are governed by rules, right? That there are rules that are societal, that are cultural, that determine what is appropriate or what is inappropriate, right? Now, as far as verbal communication, a lot of those rules we do learn formally, right? In terms of structure and grammar and how sentences are supposed to be composed, we learn spelling and those kind of things. Nonverbals, we can learn some of that, but a lot of it is learned as you go, right? The rules are much more implied. Right, they're much more implied. They're learned more informally. You sort of learn the rules of appropriate nonverbal behavior as you go. Certainly, you can learn things in a classroom setting like this and get some ideas and principles for nonverbal communication. But a lot of it is you learn much more informally, right? Much more informally. It's not usually built into the elementary school curriculum how to learn how to communicate nonverbally, right? So a lot of it's informal. It's also cultural, right? Bound by culture. The idea here is that what's appropriate varies depending on a given culture, right? So if we appreciate and value eye contact in this culture, eye contact in other cultures could be perceived as intimidating or offensive or not providing appropriate deference to someone in authority, right? So if we look at somebody in the eye here, that's a sign of respect and of listening and engagement. Other cultures could be seen as disrespectful to just look somebody in the eye. Okay, so we'll kind of look through some of those as we go as well today. Nonverbal communication is also highly personal, which means it's very idiosyncratic, right? It depends on the specific person, right, in terms of how it's used. Certain people like to be hugged, are comfortable with touch. Some people are not comfortable with touch at all, right? So it's highly personal. I'll give you a quick story on that, and this is why it's really important to be sensitive to ideas related to nonverbal communication, because it really depends on the person. When I was first hired at Marquette back in 2011, before the semester started, I came and I visited campus. My wife and I were coming here. We were going to look at places to live, so we stopped into campus and said hi. And one of my colleagues, who is now a colleague and a close friend of mine, I went up to her and I was talking with her and a couple other people, and I was like, "Hey, great to see you." And I went in to give her a hug, and she totally shrunk like this, right? And so, what do you think I might have been thinking at that moment? What's that? What'd you say?
I said, "Oh, this is weird."
This is weird. I did think that, right? What else? Awkward, right? Certainly awkward, kind of weird. What else? What else do you think I may have been thinking at that moment? When I go in to give her a hug and I'm excited to see her and she kind of shrinks. What do you think? Yeah. Yeah, actually that is exactly what I thought. I was like, man, she must have picked the other candidates, right? She must not have wanted me. Maybe I wasn't her choice. I mean, really, I didn't know her that well, so I wasn't really sure exactly how to interpret that. And what I've come to find out is she actually liked me just fine, and she was excited that I was going to be there. She's just not a hugger, right? I've known her now for 5 years, and I'm just now to where if I want to, I can give her a hug. Right? So bottom line is it's highly personal, idiosyncratic. People have different preferences. Some people are really comfortable standing super close to other people. Other people are not. They have a little bit more preference for space. Right? So it's highly personal, and part of being an effective decoder of nonverbal communication is to kind of recognize that. Because if you violate that, right, if you give somebody a hug or touch somebody that doesn't approve of that, then that can have some bad consequences. Yeah. It is Dr. Feldner, yeah. Sarah Feldner, that's my colleague, right? She's not a hugger. Now, I will tell you, if you're a comm studies or corporate comm major, at graduation, that's, right, you know, if you've ever been to the College of Communication graduation, maybe at this point, obviously, to see somebody else graduate, part of the processional line is that you hug other people, right? Some you do handshake, some you hug. And she really dreads that. She hates that because she's just not comfortable with all those hugs, right? So she really has to think about it and kind of get herself ready for that, right? So again, nonverbal communication, highly personal. So if you see Dr. Feldner, you might be able to do a fist bump, probably not a hug, at least for a couple more years. So just be mindful of that. We can also think about the fact that nonverbal communication is ambiguous. Right? It's ambiguous. If I look out right now and I see a lot of different behaviors, right? I see some folks that are looking right at me. I see some that are kind of sitting like this, right? And let me ask you, what might this mean if you're sitting there? What do you think this might mean to somebody? What are some different ways that I might interpret that? Yeah. Closed off. Yeah, kind of closed off. What else? That you're not interested. What else? If you're sitting like this. You might just be cold, right? You might be cold, like physically cold. You might also just be comfortable like that, right? Like you see people standing like that, and that's just how they like to stand. They're comfortable, right? So the bottom line is it's highly ambiguous. The idea that nonverbal communication is polysemic, right? Different things mean different things to different people, right? And so it's highly ambiguous, really difficult. The meaning kind of depends on the situation. What we're going to talk about on Wednesday is that because it's ambiguous, deciphering the meaning can be difficult. And what's important is to look for different clusters of nonverbal behaviors. Right? So if I see you folding your arms, right, and you're kind of twirling your hair, and you're nodding off, and you're not looking at my notes, I can sort of put those things together to say that it's probably more than just that you're just comfortable sitting like that, right? So it's ambiguous, so we want to look for different clusters of cues, and that's really important. Some of these things we can control, some things we cannot. Right? Some nonverbal communication we can control, like what we wear, what we decide to wear to an interview, the way we decide to shake somebody's hand, right? Whether it's a firm handshake or like a dead fish, right? Like we can control those things. Other types of nonverbal behaviors we cannot. And in that case, we could say that certain nonverbal behaviors are out of our control. They kind of leak out, right? And it's difficult to control those. But unlike verbal communication, where you can choose to say nothing, you can't not non-verbally communicate, right? You're always communicating, right? In some way, shape, or form, even if you don't mean to, right? The other people can decode that, can decipher that in their own way because it's very ambiguous. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about some functions of nonverbal communication. And this will kind of help us to think about why it's important and kind of look at the way it works and how it kind of operates in our daily communication with others. So there's a strong connection between verbal communication and nonverbal communication. So last week we talked about verbal. Right? We talked about connotative and denotative meaning. We talked about how verbal communication is cultural, how verbal communication helps to frame an interaction as either formal or informal, using high code or low code, etc. But the nonverbal communication works right in sync with verbal communication. So let's look at 5 different ways that it connects. One is that it can repeat, right? It can repeat verbal communication. So if I say, "Hi, how you doing?" and I wave, right? It can kind of repeat the verbal content. It can repeat it. "Hi, how you doing?" Right? If I say, "Hey, come here," I do this, boom, right? It can repeat verbal content. It can also substitute, right? If I'm not able to speak, I might just do this, or I might just wave from across campus or something like that, right? Across Wisconsin Ave, without saying anything, right? Or whatever, okay? Or something like that, right? So it can serve to kind of stand in for, right? Stand in or substitute. But it can also emphasize, right? So if I say, "Hey, come over here now," right? It can kind of help emphasize the message as well. "Hey, get over here now," or "Stop right now," right? Or if I'm talking to Emma, our daughter, and I'm saying, "No," I can do this, right? She totally knows what this means, and it's fantastic, right? She's like, "No," and I can do that. So I can emphasize it with my nonverbals as well. But it can also moderate, right? It can moderate, which means it can kind of play down. It can play down the verbal content, right? So if you ask your boss for a raise and he or she says, "Yeah, I think we can probably do that," right? She's saying yes, but really she's kind of playing it down, right? So there's a little bit of uncertainty, so it moderates that a little bit. It kind of tones it down a little bit. So you can kind of do that as well with nonverbals. But it can also contradict. Okay, let me ask you, if my nonverbals contradict my verbals, which one are you more likely to believe? Nonverbals. The nonverbals. Right? If you say, "Oh, I love you," and "Yeah, love you too," right? You're going to believe the nonverbals, right? Because they typically are less, because they're less controlled, right? They sort of, our true feelings can kind of ooze out a little bit when it comes to nonverbals. And we can use all of our various senses, right, to help us decode and understand what nonverbals mean. If you're talking to me in my office and you say, "Hey, how are we doing on time?" I'm like, "Oh, I got plenty of time," right? No worries at all. But then I keep looking at my watch. That might contradict that, right? It might indicate that I'm wanting to stop the conversation, right? If I keep looking at my watch or I keep moving toward the door, despite the fact that I'm saying, "Yeah, take your time, no problem," right? So it can contradict, and we typically believe the nonverbals. It also can serve to regulate the conversation, right? Open up or close down possibilities for communication. So just like we talked about Donald Trump, right, with his facial expression, typically he basically says, "I'm done with you," by the way he looks at somebody, or by facing the opposite direction, right? We can use nonverbals to regulate a conversation, to keep it going, or to stop it, right? If you're walking down Wisconsin Ave and you see somebody that you want to stop and talk to, you might slow down, right? What typically happens actually is you pass somebody and then you kind of do the weird thing where for whatever reason you just turn completely around, right? And then you do the conversation. If you're in a hurry though, you're probably just gonna be like, "Hey, good to see you," or headphones in or whatever, right? Headphones in, world out kind of thing, right? So you can do that. You can regulate a conversation based on your nonverbals, right? And what that serves to do is it serves to place parameters around a conversation, right? There's plenty of time to talk. If you come into my office and I say, "Let's have a seat," I've framed that interaction as being one where we have plenty of time, right? If we just stand up, and that's a whole different way to kind of regulate that conversation. Same idea with the watch, right? I could sort of regulate it by saying, I got to go, right? So all these different ways are ways to regulate the conversation. Can also help to identify, right? So we can identify other people based on through our different senses, right? Based on nonverbal communication, right? If somebody comes into class and they're all dressed up, there's a couple of different possible explanations for that. Maybe they just came from work or from an internship. Maybe they had a presentation in another class, right? So we can sort of identify people based on that, right? We can also identify status non-verbally, right? What might be, let me ask you, what might be in a workplace setting some ways that we can identify status through nonverbals? What do you guys think? How might we be able to identify status based on nonverbals? What do you guys think? Yeah. Okay, through posture? Yeah, tell me more. When we think about posture, what do you guys think? If what?
Can I go?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
So if someone's if you're standing up in front of the class and you're kind of like walking around and we're going to
Okay, yeah, you can sort of identify that, right? It serves to kind of frame that, okay, this is the professor, right? So there's a little status there. What else? What else in the workplace in terms of identifying status, not through nonverbals? What do you guys think? Yes? Okay, through what they wear, right? If you think about, even in a university setting, and you all may not be able to notice this quite yet, but you can actually see a lot about the overall hierarchical structure in a university based on the way people dress, right? Most of the time, administrators, right, the deans and the associate deans usually wear suits. They dress up, right? Professors usually do not. I always notice this. I'm on a couple of university committees, and I'm the only faculty member. And if I go in dressed like this, it's just fine. But on a non-teaching day, I might wear jeans and a button-down shirt or something. And they're always going to all be in suits. And you can tell I'm the faculty member based on the way I dress, right? So you can, and that's not good or bad. It's just the way it is, depending on the specific kind of workplace, right? It's acceptable and it's fine here. May not be acceptable or fine elsewhere. And so part of it is kind of reading that, understanding part of the culture of an organization is to understand what's appropriate. Right? So when we talk about cultural, nonverbals and culture, it's not just about geographical culture, but also within a certain kind of organization or setting. Okay, so it helps to identify, and you can pick up on those different nuances. It also transmits emotional information, right? So nonverbal communication transmits emotional information. It transmits emotions, our thoughts, and our feelings. A large portion of it, in fact, right, is transmitted nonverbally. Information about the other people, how we feel about somebody else, right, can be communicated nonverbally. How we feel about somebody else, how we feel about the situation that we're in, right, can be communicated nonverbally. You think, again, if you think back to the classroom behavior, right, the way you communicate says a lot about how you feel in that specific situation, and that varies, right? So we have good days and we have bad days, right? But you transmit information either intentionally or unintentionally through the way that you sit, through the way that you participate or not, so on and so forth. Can also communicate a lot about yourself, right? You think about the idea of presence, right? Think about like in a job interview situation. Do you take the situation and yourself seriously enough, right, to be able to project that presence in the way you dress, the way you shake someone's hand, so on, right? So you can transmit emotional information and thoughts and feelings about the other people, about the situation, and about yourself nonverbally. Okay. Any questions about any of these functions before we move on? We're going to dig into the different types of nonverbal communication, different codes, but real quick, any questions? So far, so good. Now, for each of these types, each of these codes, I'm going to give a bunch of examples. So I want you to take your time and write these down. I've got several different slides for each of these different codes, so don't write these down now. We're going to explore these for the rest of today, and then on Wednesday we'll explore each of these types or codes. So let's start off by talking about proxemics. When we think about proxemics, this is really the idea of space and the idea of distance, right? The idea of territory, all kind of under the heading of proxemics, right? The study of space, of distance, and of territory. So I want you to think about for each of these types, each of these nonverbal types or codes, right? These is we can communicate a variety of different ways nonverbally, and these are all ways that we can make that happen, right? We can communicate, and the way we can understand information about other people through these different codes or types. So the first one, again, space, distance, and territory. Okay, so the first thing I want us to think about is there's different spatial zones, right? Different spatial zones, and we kind of can kind of see them here, right? So more intimate space is kind of this little, imagine like an imaginary bubble, right? And then we might think about personal space as being out one step beyond that, social space as well as more public space. If you've ever told somebody or thought, man, you're in my space, you're in my personal space, right? You probably have known what it's like to have your spatial zone violated. If you are claustrophobic, you're probably not too comfortable in an elevator, right, with a lot of people. You may not be super comfortable in this setting right here because everybody's pretty close. You might prefer to spread out if you could, right? So there's different spatial zones, and the way in which we communicate with others, right, the way in which we act around other people in terms of those spatial zones can communicate, right? If we want to get close to somebody, obviously that communicates a certain message, or if we prefer to keep our distance, right? So we can communicate using space and using distance. Let's look at those a little bit more here, right? As we look at the intimate space is usually 0 to 18 inches, right? So 0 to about 1.5 feet is kind of considered intimate space. You might think about the types of people that you allow into that tight of a space, right? Obviously, someone like Dr. Feldner is not super comfortable with that, right? With that kind of space. She only will let somebody in that space after a good bit of time, right? For a hug. Obviously, you can't accomplish a hug unless you're in that intimate space. Personal space, we think about that typically as 1.5 to 4 feet, right? 1.5 to 4 feet would be considered personal space. Social space would be 4 to 12, right? 4 to 12 feet would be considered social space. So you might think about some of these if you're at a conference or something and you're in a relatively small conference room, you might stay in that 4 to 12 with most people as you're talking to them. But if it's a bigger room, you might move into the public space, 12 to 25 feet, right? 12 to 25 feet away, right? A little bit more space to kind of work from. We can also think about proxemics in terms of territory, right? The way that we use territory, the way that we occupy different types of territory can communicate about us as well. So there's a few different types of territory. There's the primary territory, which is like your apartment, right? Things, your dorm, the things that you have control over, right? So there's space and territory that you have control over, and we would call that your primary space. But there's also secondary space, right, and public space. So secondary is space that you establish or that you own, quote unquote, through repeated use, right? So even in a classroom where you do not have assigned seats, oftentimes you sit in kind of the same seat in every class, right? Or at least in the same space. And you might even consider that your own seat, right? So if you go to a class all semester and one day you show up and somebody's in your seat, you're like, oh man, that's just totally messed me up, right? So we kind of have what I like to call the psychological seat, right? Normal place where we typically sit. It's not a space that you own, but you establish ownership after repeated use, right? And then same with public space, right? Which is space that's open to everyone, like at a park, for instance. If you go sit outside on a lawn somewhere on campus, you may have one area that you typically like to sit in, and if somebody's in that space, right, you just can't quite process it. You can't make sense of it because you have that one space where you like. If you work at the coffee shop in the union, right, you might have one table that you like. When you can't sit there, it's just kind of messes you up, right? Because you have your own space there. Library, same kind of thing. What I want to say here is that we typically mark our territory in certain ways. Let me ask you this. How do dogs mark their territory? Yeah, they pee on things, right? Like male dogs, right? They sort of mark their territory by peeing on things, and we do the same thing. We actually don't pee on things. What we do, though, is we might go and set a book down somewhere, right? Like if you're in a meeting and you get there early, you might go set something down, like your lunchbox or your book or whatever, right? You ever done that and then somebody still sits there? Right? And you're like, dude, seriously? I have my stuff in the seat and they still do it. So even though it's not your space, we still mark our territory in the same way, right? In the same way that the animals do. So let's look at a couple of examples of where we might think about nonverbals. And I'm going to show one quick look at that in a second. But you guys may have seen this Icebreakers commercial here. Right, so certainly for icebreakers, they've highlighted all the spatial zones, right, and then they kind of substitute the intimate space with icebreakers space, right? Here's another one I want us to think about. See if you've ever known somebody like this.
Hey Phil, hey, I just got that email. Looks like we're going to be working together. Yeah, great, right? Yeah, it's awesome. I'm so excited. Yeah, we're going to make a great team. I think so. Yeah, I'm very excited. Yeah, it's going to be great. Yeah. So I'm just going to get some coffee. Oh, okay. Hey, you like hazelnut, right? Yeah, it's great. I got a pound of hazelnut stashed in the freezer. Great, it's awesome. Let's get some. Okay, great.
Anybody ever known someone like that, right? That just has no concept of space, right? And in different cultures, people have different preferences for that, right? In terms of how close you can get, right? In some cultures, we typically are a culture that prefers a little bit more space, right? We're kind of comfortable in that personal space, not so much. But in certain cultures, you want to be so close, they like to actually be able to feel and smell your breath to be able to talk to you and trust you. All right, I'm looking at faces, you're like, oh, that's nasty. And I would agree, that is kind of gross, right? But in other cultures, that's totally appropriate, right? And they want to be up close so they can, again, kind of feel your breath and be that close. But if you have someone like this, right, you kind of think, man, back off a little bit, right? So we don't say, hey, you violated my proxemic norm, right? We sort of have our ways of kind of dealing with that through backing up and kind of compensating for that when people get way too close like that. Another thing we want to think about is the idea of spatial arrangements, right? The idea of spatial arrangements. And here, I want to present a couple of examples here. But this is what we might call object language, right? Object language. The idea that we can communicate through our use of objects, through the way that we set up, the way that we arrange our apartments and our homes and our classrooms and those kind of things. So we actually have a way of communicating through objects, right? Through spatial arrangements. You guys know people, you've probably been in different professors' offices that are super clean, right, versus others that are really, really cluttered, right? I really like this thing here, right? If a cluttered desk signs a cluttered mind, what then is an empty desk a sign, right? And I'm the kind of person that likes my desk pretty clean, right? I like to have my space kind of clean, so maybe that means that my mind is empty. I'm not sure, but it works for me, right? So you probably know people who have their desk a total mess, but if you ask them for something, they know where something is, right? I had a professor at Purdue who, it was literally like an episode of Hoarders, right? Like if you went into his office, he just had stacks of books, stacks of articles, and when you came in to sit there, he wouldn't even like give you a chair. You would literally sit on like a stack of books, right? But if you asked him for something, he'd be like, oh yeah, hang on a second. He would go into the like weirdest stack and pull it out, right? So that, for me, that was awful. I hated being in there, but it totally worked for him, right? So people have their own kind of system of organized chaos in that respect, right? And so what I want to talk about here is the idea of proxemics in our everyday lives, right? And some of the ways that we can sort of use our space purposefully and communicate in a certain way. So let me ask you this. What about if we have an arrangement like this in an office setting? What might this communicate? What might this communicate if you walk into an office and you see this? Pretty common office space, yeah. Okay, it can communicate that everybody's equal, level playing field. What else? What else? So the idea that everybody's kind of on a level playing field, yeah? Okay, so you could see it as they actually, so it's kind of the opposite, the downside of that, right? They don't really respect a lot of individuality if everybody's kind of in that kind of space, right? As an employer, this might communicate that collaboration is important, right? That's actually the reason behind the cube movement, right? Was the idea that we want more collaboration. If you're at this desk, right? If you're sitting at this desk, you can pop over and say, hey, Jeremy, I got a question for you, right? So it promotes collaboration, at least that was the idea, right? So let me ask you this, what does this communicate? This is my office here. Just kidding, that's not really my office. But if you walk into this, right, your boss's office and it looks like this, what might that communicate? What do you guys think? What do you notice in there? Yeah. Probably a pretty high up position, right? What else? Yeah. Yeah, authority, right? So you can kind of tell a lot about status and authority based on this. I mean, this guy, or female has friggin' desk, conference table, chairs, right? The more space, right? So you think about even the way that you use space or sit in a chair, you spread out to demonstrate power. Same with office spaces, right? We kind of spread out and demonstrate power in that same respect. This really is my office, actually. What do you notice in here? Picture's not great. This resolution's not fantastic. But what do you notice in here? In this office? Okay. More comfortable in what way? Tell me more.
It kind of has like a relaxed feeling.
Okay. A little more of a relaxed feel. Yeah, what else do you notice? What's that? Okay, there's a window in there. That's nice, yeah. What else? What else? Yeah. Okay, it looks a little more lived in. I like that, yeah. So these are all true. And this was, for me, the way that I set my office up was very intentional, right? When I originally moved into my office, the desk was actually facing a different direction, right? It was where when you walk in, that's the first thing you saw, right? Was the desk. And then to come sit down, you'd be on one side, I'd be on the other, right? And I moved it to be a certain way. You can't really tell here, but there's also a stand-up desk in there, right? So you can tell more about a person in terms of, do they like to stand up when they work, and And if so, why, right? That's kind of a big movement now, right? Companies are more committed to health, and there's a lot of research, at least for right now, that demonstrates that standing up when you work can be helpful, right? Also a conference table in there, right, and some other things that you might notice. And it is comfortable. This is actually, you might want to come see me sometime just to sit in that chair. It's really awesome, right? But you can kind of tell it looks lived in, it's more comfortable, it's more open, more relaxed, right? And that's all very intentional. Let me ask you this, like this is a picture of my bookshelf, right? What do you suppose you might be able to glean from looking at somebody's bookshelf? Right? Let's say you go into a job interview, right? What information might you be able to tell just from looking at somebody's bookshelf? What do you guys think? Yeah. Yeah, their interests. What else? Okay, intelligence level. I might have not have read any of these. I might just put them in there because they look good, right? It could be, right? But you can get some pictures of that. Yeah.
Not only do you have books, but you have like a quote on them.
Absolutely. So there's a quote in there. There's also, a coffee mug. If you were looking, you might see this, which is a meditation chime, right? But here's the takeaway here, right? Here's what I want you to get from this, is that there are employers who they want you to make a connection with them, right? So if you go into a job interview, right, I've heard recruiters say that if a candidate doesn't make a connection with me in the first 5 minutes, that person's pretty much automatically ruled out, right? So the bottom line here is that when you walk into someone's space, you want to be able to look around and kind of get a sense of what types of interests so you can make an immediate connection, right? And you can tell a lot through the way that people place objects and kind of set up their offices. What about this? What do you notice going on here? If you were to look at this office, what can you tell? Yeah.
They like Texas.
They like Texas. We do know that Texans are pretty proud, right? So you got a really big Texas flag, yeah? What else? Yes? Yeah, a lot of pictures, a lot of memories. Obviously, this is a person who does not believe in the kind of minimalist decorating technique, right? So a lot of pictures, a lot of things related to pictures, here is with a doctoral advisor or a friend, some things with the Space Center, right? Also other things related to spatial arrangement, books and other types of things. What about this one here? What do you see in this arrangement? What do you notice there? Okay, yeah, very organized. Yeah, what else? Not a whole lot going on the walls here. What else? Yeah.
There's a lack of personal information displayed.
Okay, yeah, lack of personal information, right? Yeah. So what do you think that could say?
More of a private person.
Okay,
Or this
yeah.
office is more for work and
Absolutely.
Not necessarily for sharing
Yeah.
personal
Yeah,
moments.
it's sort of like, so the way to think about that is the office is more for work, right? So you can kind of have more of the work-life separation by the way you set up an office, right? If you come into my office, I've got pictures, more family pictures. If you go to, for instance, Katie Berg's office, she has a ton of family pictures in hers, right? So you can really tell, there's a big difference in terms of people's preference for what they have. What else? What else do you see? I saw another hand up somewhere. What else do you notice when you look at this arrangement or this office space? What do you think? Yeah.
You get like a higher sense of authority since you're behind that.
Yeah.
You're in front of the desk and they're behind it.
Yeah.
It's not like it's personal.
Yeah, absolutely. So you may perceive it as less personal, right? If you come in and you sit on this side, but if she wants to make you more comfortable, she could say, you know what? Let's sit on the other side. And you could face each other, right? And that frames that interaction as a little bit more comfortable, right? It might try to set you at ease. The example I want to give here as well is this is the way my office used to be set up like this, and I was talking to another colleague, not this particular one, and I said I wanted to move my desk, because I didn't want there to be too much of a power differential. And the response from this particular faculty was, no, I like to keep my desk that way because I like the power. Right? I like the power differential, right? And that was a quote. He likes the power differential, right? So again, you can be very intentional about the way you set up your office, and one is not necessarily bad or good. It's just the way that whatever your preference is and the way that you design something. Let's look at another way to think about territory and arrangements and how you might communicate. What if we have a classroom set up like this? What kind of interaction can we expect in that? What might be a way to think about what's going to happen in that classroom? What do you guys think? Yeah. Okay. Not quite as much class discussion, perhaps, right? We sort of think about that in this arrangement too, right? It's usually a little bit more traditional lecture, although as we do in here, you can certainly pull it off if you want. What about something like this? What does the U shape help us accomplish? Yeah.
More collaboration.
Yeah, more collaboration. Obviously, like if these folks can talk, or pretty much everybody can talk. But you know what? There's still somebody at the front, right? There's still somebody at the head of the room, of the classroom, or whatever the case may be. I teach a graduate seminar on Tuesday nights, and this is how we kind of have it set up, right? It's a little bit more of a U shape, right? What about this? What do you see here? Yeah, more of a discussion, right? These folks, man, they might just actually be just chilling on the ground, right? They might just kind of be sitting there, right? What about in this? Totally different kind of arrangement. Do you guys work like this in some of your classes, right? Right? So you can sort of think about this. If you have a big idea as a class, before you try to discuss it as a big group, you might meet into small groups first, right? And there could be benefits of that because, for one, certain people may be more comfortable talking to 5 people as opposed to 25, right? So again, you can very intentionally design a space, in this case a classroom, to try to get more ideas or whatever the goal may be for that particular frame for that communication, right? Whatever the setting is. Okay, so let's move on from proxemics and talk a little bit about kinesics, or body movement, right? Kinesics is all about body movement. It's not just necessarily about movement, though. We're also going to talk about personal appearance under this category as well. But for now, think about kinesics in terms of the body, in terms of movement. So one thing we want to think about is the idea of stance or posture, right? That you can read a lot about a person based on their stance or their posture, right? Whether or not somebody's open may invite more conversation. Whether or not somebody's kind of, sitting back like this or closed off, right? Can either open up or close off the possibility of a conversation, right? So the posture means a lot. This would be considered more of an open posture, right? I mean, really, with palms out and everything, right? If you kind of stand a little bit more of an open posture like this, it can be more inviting. I can also think about about facial movements as well, right? The idea that you can tell a lot about somebody based on their facial movements, including their eye movements. Did anybody ever see the show? It was on several years ago, but called Lie to Me. You guys have heard about that, right? That show is actually based on a lot of communication research by a researcher named Paul Ekman, right? And that was a guy who was kind of the expert in nonverbal communication, right? And so that show is all about kinesics as it pertains to the face especially, right? And that's all really cool. There's a lot of lie detecting that goes on just by watching the mouth. The example I gave earlier with Tom Brady, again, if you wanted to, you can Google Tom Brady body language, and that will come up. There's a full analysis of his press conference after Deflategate, where it goes very step by step. It looks at eye movement and facial movement and everything else. So there was an article that came out just a week ago, and you can check this one out as well. If you look up, let's see, I think it was Wall Street Journal, networking at a party. There's a whole spread on this 1 week ago, and it talks a little bit about different ways that people stand, right? So these folks here, as you see them, they're a little bit more open, right? They're just kind of sitting there, and this whole idea is about how to read a room, right? Reading a room is a skill that can be learned. So these folks, you're more likely to be approached, right? And you would more likely to approach them if they're standing like this, right? If you've got folks like this, right? They're just, you kind of walk. It's really much more difficult to break into that kind of group right there, right? They're obviously kind of in a circle. They're having fun, right? Unless you know that it may be difficult to kind of break in, right? These folks here, and they seem like they're kind of bored. They might welcome somebody to come in and kind of interrupt, right? To talk with them. This guy right here is, and this is kind of funny, but he's got a pocket full of business cards and a big smile. He's obviously trying to sell something or just trying too hard to network, right? So you may not want to encounter. This guy's pretty shy. He's over here just chilling by the punch bowl in the food. He might welcome a conversation, right? So again, the idea with this is there's really important practical and professional benefits from learning how not only to convey information purposefully with your nonverbals, but also how to read other people's nonverbals. And in this case, how to network at a party or at a conference or whatever. So let's go ahead and stop there. We're going to pick up where we left off on Wednesday, and we'll talk a little bit more about kinesics and then finish up. Enjoy the rest of your day. I'll see you guys Wednesday.